I'm thinking we ought to just keep going with these Jung's Red Book for Our Time things because a lot of them are quite good. And a lot of them are quite good and food for thought for everybody. And so that's my thought. And
Yeah. Well, also it'd be nice, I think, to take it in smaller chunks. We did the hard part first, do the big piece, and then now we can do all little satellites.
yeah. Okay. So Jung's Red Book for Our Time. Now, did I get out to YouTube? I did. And I even have a chat up. Oh, very good. And I think I have Art with us. So that's a good place to start. Hi, Art.
Hey,
Good
Art.
morning. Uh, and we have two and growing. Just curious, how many people watched this last week, just out of curiosity? Let's switch accounts. Wait a minute. All right, I'm setting up, folks, and oh, there it is. Your channel. That's what I wanted to look at for a moment. Okay, 226 people watched the first half of this last week, so that's a good number.
Yeah.
And we have a growing number in all of our sessions, so I'm pleased with that. And from long experience now, I know that these things make a difference. Okay, I mean, in the collective, they make a difference because I've seen, something that happened in Turkey just change the country and change a lot of lives. Unfortunately, some of those lives were my friends, but it does make a difference. And
I think it's interesting that algorithms of you or I will say something, and then that day I'm at my table or whatever, and on Instagram or somewhere, the algorithm pulls up some post to feature, and it's that did they just quote me? Did they just quote you? Why did And even on some of the Jungian Society stuff, I'm like, well, why are you saying what I say 3 hours after I say the same? And it's interesting because then they'll say something, and then maybe I'll get something new from what their comments do. And it's kind of funny because I don't want to play chicken and the egg. Don't need to get any kind of credit, but it's being on that bleeding edge piece of a lot of people talking about a lot of the same things, a lot of the same ways.
yeah, no, they definitely are hearing us.
Yeah, if you want to do research, you just hold up this and just don't even do anything, just talk, and then all of a sudden, boom, boom, boom. Oh, look at all these ads. What's that book?
Yeah. Okay, so we are working with Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt. We are working with volume 1. There are actually 5 volumes of this set. You can acquire them from chiron.com or Amazon, where they both are, where they all are. And at Chiron, you can get many other things and get many other ideas about Jungian psychology that you should look at. They're all important. Um, and we're talking about the psyche because we are talking about Jungian psychology. And if and so it's subjective, not objective. And if you go to anybody that's Freudian, you're only going to get objective, and um, you'll get a lot of statistics, but you won't really know anything.
Well, it reminds me. I mean, it's funny. He says it in I think better words than I have before. Where if that whole Freudian piece, the ignorance and prevailing bustle witnessed within the self-referential and detail-obsessed chairs of our university institutions. I mean, the academic ivory towers. I mean, self-publication, it's not respected. It's, validation is for parking. I don't need your nod to say what I'm going to do. And I
Yeah.
think it's the whole degree piece is skewed now because
Oh, yeah.
it's not a rite of passage, and it's not even really certification. It's a lot of insurance generated stuff, and
Yeah.
people more and more are doing their own thing, and they're doing their own thing their own way well. And I think that's what really increases the knowledge, because you can not just communicate, you comprehend and connect with
Yeah.
things.
Don't misunderstand us, folks. You do have to get your ticket punched for professions like the law, or for professions like university teaching. Um, and that means a PhD or a JD, and MD if you're going to be a doctor. But once you get those tickets punched, then start thinking for yourself, because that's what Jordan is saying here.
Yeah, because I remember calling my insurance agent and saying, "Hey, I've been an expert witness for 6 months, and I'm barbecuing opposing counsel weekly." And
Yeah.
when I walk in the room, there's the F. I mean, and which to me always made me pretty happy. But I called her and said, well, I'm not getting sued. I'm on the opposite end of that. I'm barbecuing people we're trying to sue. So shouldn't my insurance premium go down? Oh no, that's a higher profile of exposure. And she doubled my policy. And
Jeez.
a structural engineer had told me, keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. Right.
And so I learned the hard way.
Yeah, you have to learn the hard way. So we had an interesting visitation this week, which was two Tibetan Buddhist monks, or nuns, I'm sorry, nuns, not monks, who came to visit us. They're both ladies who started in Tibet. One came out of Tibet when she was 13, and the other when she was 20. And they lived in India for 23 years, and now they've come to America. And interestingly enough, the one who came out at 13 is the more senior of the two, because she has the equivalent of a PhD in Tibetan Buddhist studies. And and so it was quite interesting. They had never been to the water, and Debbie took them out to the pier that we have, and one of them leans over the railing of the pier and says "Om" to the fish. She wanted to
Nice.
make sure she got through to them. So here we go. All right, so we are on page 22 of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And we're reading the essay of Thomas Arzt, which is a masterful essay. I love it. I've always loved it. It made me friends with Thomas Arzt. Unfortunately, Thomas was one of the first COVID casualties. He died on Easter Sunday, 2020. And I was hoping to meet him at Aranos, but that whole thing got canceled, and I never got my money back. And I gotta think about how to get credit for that donation.
Right.
So anyway, we're on page 22, and we're starting with the second half of this essay. The first half was about basically defining what postmodern means. And that is essentially that all the boundaries have broken down, and we can nobody in the world can any longer think that they're only this or only that. And so we have to find a new way to define our psyches and what we're about. And so that's one of the things that this second half does, and it's in the context of Christianity. So I'll read the first page here, page 22. My soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call you. Are you there? On November 12th, 1913, Jung began his inner work on what would eventually become his Red Book. This dramatic passage occurs in the chapter titled Refinding the Soul. In a preliminary remark, Jung had noted that he had been able to attain honor, power, wealth, knowledge, and every human happiness, while distress in his inner and the outer worlds had overcome him with horror. Given his break with Sigmund Freud and the resulting state of questioning his previous understanding of the psyche, Jung's distress becomes understandable. Weighing heavily also was a series of remarkable dreams, visions, and waking fantasies that left him bewildered to the point of suspecting an impending psychosis. Slowly, however, Jung began to realize that, for instance, his waking fantasies in October 1913, in which Europe was flood ravaged, described in precognitive form events that were about to happen, not uniquely to him, but to Europe collectively with the outbreak of World War I. Within this personal, highly disturbed state of mind, and within the catastrophic world situation, something else that had already bothered Jung after putting the finishing touches on symbols of the libido, that's psychology of the unconscious in English, again became painfully evident to him, namely that a man who thinks he can live without myth or outside it is an exception. He is like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or with the ancestral life, which continues within him, or yet with contemporary human society. Then, stating his own personal dilemma, he continues, quote, I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living? I found no answer to this question and had to admit that I was not living with a myth or even in a myth, but rather in an uncertain cloud of theoretical possibilities, which I was beginning to regard with increasing distrust. I did not know that I was living a myth, and even if I had known it, I would not have known what sort of myth was ordering my life without my knowledge. So in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, and I regarded this as the task of tasks. For, so I told myself, how could I, when treating any patients, make the allowance for the personal factor for my personal equation, which is yet necessary for a knowledge of the other person, if I was unconscious of it? I simply had to know what unconscious or preconscious myth was forming me, from what rhizome I sprang. I'll stop there. Um, Obviously, much of what is in the passage that I read is in the very beginning of the Red Book. And if you haven't read the Red Book, you can go back and listen to Jordan and my reading and commentary of the Red Book, which began about 2 years ago. And we did it on a weekly basis with some brief vacations for the entire 2 years. And now we're in the process of getting back to what the Red Book is about. So, Jordan, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting. I remember in college putting in some paper, writing about postmodernism, that it avoids and eliminates the rhizomatic fabric. And of course, those were me making up words that kind of maybe existed, kind of maybe didn't. But it was the memory structures of each cell, the memory structure of each self. And it was basically a juvenile postmodernism felt like a juvenile glider being tugged by a cable behind a plane, but acting like the plane wasn't there. And that which pulled you into the air, that which the shoulders you stood on basically, was ignored, as if it just, I think it's suigeneris, sui generis, I think, which is coming into being of its own accord, all on its own. And that's impossible. I mean, that's kind of origin story of universe, or no beginning, or that's the beginning. Where this, when he says from what rhizome I sprang, there's that rhizomatic fabric, the memory structure of the lineage of your life, and not just parental, family in general, just from a whole evolutionary context perspective, that from what rhizome I sprang. These days, I'm not into self-development, and I'm into living it into being. They're always complete, never finished, lifelong. And I think a lot of people, I notice what I call spiritual elitism. Now instead of the academic ivory tower, it's, oh no, I'm more evolved than you. And it's hocus pocus. It's still adolescent postmodern posturing. And yeah, I don't need to grouse my chest out. I don't need, again, validation is just for parking, and I don't. I like, an accolade that's well placed is great, but I'd rather the discussion and the conversation than anyone saying, oh, that person or this person is so brilliant and this and that. It's like, well, let's get off the adjectives and keep to the substance. So I think the rhizome he's talking about, from what rhizome I sprang, what is my history? What is my lineage that made me here? And if I just finalize that all up, it's basically, what gemstone, what rock formation am I? And if you asked a rock, who are you? If it could speak English, it'd just laugh at you. It has no need of that self-reflection. It learns, it does its stuff its way. But I think that whole metaphor, breath is prayer, where nature is God. And you end up with not inner divinity, it's the I am, you are, we are, each, all God. And in that sense, we're stepping past the pedant kind of juvenile catechism, numbing people down into it's somehow external. It's in you. It's your rhizome, your roots.
Right. Well,
Colleen said, no rootless flower. I mean, that's the whole blooming rhizome in totality. Just in when she said no rootless flower, that says the whole story. Once upon a time, there is no rootless flower, the end. And it's a complete story.
Right. And this story goes back to literally to the Big Bang. Okay. In other words, life itself and the potentiality for life in the universe of which we're the only example so far that we can find, was already there at the time of the Big Bang. And so all of our ancestors, every one of our ancestors going all the way back to single-celled organisms, did two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. And so that potentiality was already in the single-celled organism. Okay, the single cell. That was already in the single cell. And it's definitely true that all life has come from that single cell, all life. And so I'm talking about even before the invention of sex, which it was a grand invention, no doubt. But if we look at all mammals, for example, all mammals have two eyes, two ears, a nose, and a mouth. And many of them look surprisingly like us. And so that's evolution from the beginning, but the potentiality of everything, every giraffe, every whale, every human being was already there in a single cell. And then two cells met and they invented sex. And then they differentiated. Once they invented sex, then they differentiated. And then they became every living being. Okay, now I'm not saying there was only one cell at the beginning. I'm saying that from the Big Bang, every cell that was the first cell in an ancestral lineage had its beginning there. And finally, about 3.5 billion years ago, according to science, life emerged. And life at the beginning was only a single cell. And then those single cells that were there ultimately saw another single cell and they liked what they saw or felt or whatever it was they experienced, and they invented sex. And since then, all of our ancestors have done two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. That's it. And you and I are symbols of the success of all of our ancestors going back to those single-celled organisms to exist. Okay, so when we talk about rhizome basically has a reference to this is how this creature develops. And so, Trump, or good Lord, boy, there's a Freudian slip. Jung. Jung often talks about the weaver bird. And that weaver bird, when it comes along, already knows how to make its nest. And it makes it the same way as all of its ancestors did. And it doesn't have any books to study or anything. They just do it.
Right.
And this is the same for most of our ancestors. It's only human beings that have become weak, and we still do a lot of things that we never directly learned because they're in our psyche, in our unconscious. But for example, just replacing our cells every 7 years. We do that. All human beings do that. And
Oh, your video froze.
And develop tools and differentiate and so on. And so about 500 years ago, we invented the scientific method that allowed us about 120 years ago to develop, or 130 years ago to develop the automobile, and 121 years ago the airplane. And those are examples of things that have kept developing. And and they're going to continue to keep developing until, some space lasers take out the Earth or whatever it is. But until that time, things are going to get more and more complex. And even if human beings don't survive, who's to say that um, whales or giraffes in their progeny won't take over intelligence at some point?
Mm-hmm.
And
Or ants.
or ants, more likely, yeah, more likely the ants will take over the world, yeah.
The social structure.
Right. And so when Jung talks about the rhizome in this passage, and I'm going to read his quote again because I want you to hear it again and be prepared for it. He is talking about the rhizome within his psyche. And all of us, and when he says myth here, I think he's talking about archetypes. Okay, in other words, all of us at certain periods in our life are taken over by an archetype that causes us to do certain things. Men go out to become heroes. This is the hero myth that Joseph Campbell expounded on very heavily, and Jung talked about it, so Campbell took it from him. Or maybe they both took it from somebody who had figured it out long ago. But the hero myth is certainly present, but also the myth of mother and so on. And so at certain points of your life, if you're a woman, you're probably going to have a child, more than 90% sure that as a woman you'll have a child. Why? Because your archetype tells you to do that. And at the same time, in adolescence, both sexes get interested in sex to make sure that that happens. Right? And
Mm-hmm.
and it's a very, very powerful force, of course, when it starts to emerge in anybody's life. And so what Jung was trying to understand was what was the myth he is living, because he wasn't living the typical hero myth, or his hero myth writ large is much bigger. And this is what Edward Edinger said about Jung, that his psyche was so immense and his understanding of his psyche was so immense that Edinger could spend the next 40 years of his life only describing Jung's psyche without really going into his own, which was also complex. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, because when I wrote The Voice of the Queen of Cups in my book, the companion book that goes with my deck that I created, the Queen of Cups said, "The wisdom of the ages lives lives within you. The wisdom of the ages lives within you." And what's interesting, sometimes I've been called anti-intellectual because I'm going this academic ivory tower, anti-capitalist, all this kind of stuff. I'm going, no. What it is I'm anti non-nature, and the nature did not create a person. The person creates themselves by harnessing their inner nature, so connected to nature. And I was this last week with a client at the table, They were a microbiologist, so their analogy set was pretty much nature
Hmm.
and at a cellular level. And at one point, I came to the realization, I said, well, if we look at an ovum, a female egg, and a sperm, a zygote, um, and I say sacred feminine, that's sacred generative, the heart of the matter, and then masculine sacred formative, the vessel, the containment system. What's interesting is in the female, then the ovum, the egg, is actually the masculine vesseling of the containment. And the sperm, which actually looks kind of like the astrological Mars symbol, the circle with the arrow, it's feminine because it is generative. So each having the other physiologically within
Hmm.
became again that we each have both, and the wisdom of the ages lives within. It resides within. And
Right.
so tapping into your inner inheritances, as it were, I, I look at the whole status quo institutional system. I don't come against intellectual. It's the institutional that averages out the average, takes the high out, takes the low out, makes the boring of the boringest, that somehow is applicable to everybody. The reality is it's taking so long from when you're connected up to age, say, 7 or 8, when you move towards the dad, you move
Right.
towards the formative, you move towards the structure to get to your own structure without stricture. And I think what's interesting is then by the time you get your degree, you've kind of forgotten what it was to even be you and connected. And
Right.
now you're trying to people please, prove, certify, and I think that's really where I can kind of unpack the validation is just for parking. You just need to
Right.
feel it in your gut, and if I can explain my gut feeling, it's not a gut feeling. It's not an intuition. That's wishful thinking,
Right.
Whereas the gut is the fish against the current. The current contains it. There's a proper pressure. And people talking about, oh, so much stress, oh, so much stress. Well, to me, stress, it's just a force applied.
Hmm.
Strain is when something bends or is influenced,
Yeah.
bent or broken. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so in terms of these things, of course, the hero myth does exist, and so young men tend to be attracted to the military sometimes because they think they can become a hero easily only by putting on certain clothes. And
Right.
so and so they put if they put on those clothes, um, they are treated as heroes because and women love uniforms, right? Because wow, those are the heroes in the group, and I want to marry a hero. I want my children to be fathered by a hero, right? and so women tend to be attracted to the uniforms, and men are attracted to them too because among other things, they attract women. Um, but
And they're kind of the peacock feathers. And here's the
sure,
display. Here,
right,
and
right,
it's not a super,
exactly.
here's the display.
Yeah, here's the display, and but the trouble is, that's not who the heroes are necessarily. I mean,
Right.
uh, and uh, and I've always been uncomfortable with the uh, write-off that people often give of thank you for your service, as if, okay, now they've taken care of all their obligations to me vis-a-vis whatever I did in the 60s and 70s, particularly. And I've always been uncomfortable with that. But this week I heard a comeback that I rather like, and I think that's true and that it's true. And that is when somebody says, thank you for your service, I'm going to say, thank you for being worth my service. And thank you for uh, being part of a family that makes my country worth fighting for and potentially dying for. That's
Mm,
how I can
that,
reply. Um,
mhm.
and And that's the first time I've heard a comeback that I liked. Otherwise, to me, it's what the Pennsylvania Dutch say is hoogmoedig, which is prideful. And I don't go out of my way here to talk about my military service for that same reason that, yeah, that was then and this is now, and this is what I'm doing today. And I'm trying to make a contribution to the world that 11 people right now online, now 12, seem to think is worth spending a few minutes with. And I hope that what Jordan and I say today will be recorded and available on YouTube for at least a century, maybe more. and
I
and
think that
right,
I always think that the thank you for your service is a naive and dangerously rude, cruel thing to say, because you're asking a question about a potentially traumatizing, you know, terrorizing, intense experience, and you have no business picking at the capstones of what that person has resolved. And it's not a history place where you have business asking.
yeah,
And
that's
so I
that's
don't,
right.
I'm
And
just,
and the men who did serve in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, men and women. Um, but especially coming back from Vietnam, some of my fellow servicemen were spit upon. I mean, it was a time like today, and a popular demonstration among children like that was to spit upon servicemen, and they had no idea of the individual they were spitting on. They had no idea whether that person was a hero or a coward. They had no idea of the motivations of that individual in terms of joining the service. Um, and to this day, almost no one fully appreciates my motivations because um, I knew Vietnam was wrong from 1962. I still joined the Marines in 1967, not because I changed my mind. I always thought it was wrong, but
mm-hmm.
but um,
Well,
but
your dad informs you, they're going out, they have to
right,
make rank. The generals have to make rank.
right, exactly, and it just grated on me that, but at the same time, you have to become part of your society and you have to choose. Are you going to be part of your society as it's structured, or are you going to try to change it? And many of my contemporaries decided to try to change it, and some of them left the country, and they were very courageous people. They were heroic people because they did change American society for the better, while I went out and got experience as the traditional society member. And it's only in my dotage that I've moved away from that. It doesn't mean that I move away from my fellow Marines. I don't. And I still would rather be in a trench with a Marine than anybody else, no doubt. But, and I still believe in my country and et cetera. But, But my rationale for joining in the first place was quite different, and I haven't even nearly described it. So let's
Mm-hmm.
move on. Okay, so I'm going to read this personal dilemma of Jung's again, just so you can hear it. So please pay close attention this time. It may be hard to do it when I'm reading through something and it just goes by you, but let's read this one again. I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living? I found no answer to this question and had to admit that I was not living with a myth or even in a myth. but rather in an uncertain cloud of theoretical possibilities, which I was beginning to regard with increasing distrust. I did not know that I was living a myth, and even if I had known it, I would not have known what sort of myth was ordering my life without my knowledge. So, in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, and I regarded this as the task of tasks. For, so I told myself, how could I, when treating my patients, make due allowance for the personal factor for my personal equation, which is yet so necessary for a knowledge of the other person. If I was unconscious of it, I simply had to know what unconscious or preconscious myth was forming me, from what rhizome I sprang. And I think Edward Edinger would say about this that Jung's whole life was exploring that rhizome. And as Jung said at the end of his life, the work he found and the work that we are partially now doing was too big for only one life. And he couldn't do it all himself, but he did a heck of a lot with all his volumes of collected works and letters and so on. So
I think one quote that he has of his that synopsizes this, that came to me as you were reading it again. He said, and at this point he's what, 42 years old. He said, the first 40 years of your life is just research.
yeah,
And
sure.
so in that sense, the first 40 years of his life was building this boat, this
Right.
vessel, and now he's about to embark on it for the
And
rest of
fill
it
it and
and
fill it
fill
for
it.
the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And um and this building behind me, Bollingen, which was his retreat house, um, was his testimony in stone. He never plumbed it. He never put
Mm-hmm.
electricity in it. He wanted to live as a person lived before the scientific method. He wanted to experience what a man is versus what a man who's been trained in a certain way is. And so that's what he did. And so that's why he said, this is a testament in stone.
Right.
And, very few people know what's inside there even today. And, I think at some point we will come to know. Um, but, uh, it's like the Red Book. It took 48 years for it to emerge after Jung's life because he said, um, who would understand it today?
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're in the process of coming to understand it. And, I feel very confident that this point about the rhizome is one of the central points of the whole Red Book, which is look to your inner self for what to do next, whatever it is. And this is why I've emphasized my painting as an example, but anybody can do whatever floats their boat. Right now, this painting that I'm doing, I'm trying to take from the unconscious
Mm-hmm.
so that I can understand what my unconscious is asking of me. And so far, what it's asking is do more painting.
Well, yeah, and honestly, if I even abstract this elevation perspective of Jung's home of Bollingen, um, it's and when he says testament in stone, I can unpack that and say, look at the crystal formation geode that is entirely him. And
Mhm.
stone doesn't have any self-conscious need to tell you what it is. It just has its own resonant qualities and it inhabits nature in its own unique way. And that house, I mean, I never thought this before, but if I go to the rock store and I have this crystal piece that someone's pulled out of a hill,
Yeah.
and it has all these different things sticking up. Look at this crystal, and the different shapes that it's forming that are all part of itself.
Yeah. So Refined Hayseed has given us a great quote. He says, "My last connection with the scientific method is to give up golf." And that reminds me of the last time I played golf, which was um, as a lawyer, it's almost de rigueur that you have to learn to play golf, and I was always miserable at it. But occasionally, I would get sucked into a lawyer's tournament, and almost invariably, I would have the worst score out there. But one of these events, they had an electronic system that watched your swing so that they could give you advice about how to change your swing to be a better golfer. And I did the swing and I saw all the who's what's it's that they were putting on a screen and all the advice they were giving me. And I said, "Good God, I'm going to go to some going sailing. No more golf for me."
Well, you know what Mark Twain said about golf?
What?
He said golf is just a way to interrupt an otherwise perfectly good walk in nature.
So Kathy says, does anyone ever come to know the inside of another human? And of course, that is uh, an emphatic no for that. We never know for sure, and um, half of our marriages end in divorce because we don't know the other person and what myth um, they're living by. And um, my first marriage failed because I didn't know that my uh, ex-wife, who I still love kind of like a sister, she's the mother of my children. Um, I didn't know that the myth she wanted to live by was to be the wife of a small town lawyer, and that was never going to be me. And I wish that we had better advice back when I was in the courting age about who you should try to marry. And uh, so anyway, but
Well, and I
go.
think you're kind of that really, I find the most applicable place of that concept of dignity in difference. Always making sure I don't say indifference, not
Yeah.
ambivalence. Dignity in difference is starting to apply most to relationship stuff, where
Hmm.
whether it's romantic or otherwise. Um, but the knowing someone for at least 90 days, no one can keep up a lie more than 90 days, or the people who aren't liars, the people who we all change a little bit season to season to season,
Yeah.
spring, winter, summer, fall
Sure.
personality. And I think the dignity in difference is don't knock off their personal cultural heritage sharp edges.
Yeah.
Learn how to not get cut. I mean, the rose has thorns. Pick it up, but understand that there's going to be influence back and forth. I mean, Jung said, when two people meet, there's a reaction. I mean, even if it's no reaction, that's still a reaction.
Yeah.
But the compatibility then of how two completely different people, things interact is there's a piece now where then, well, first you have to be an adult. You're yourself. You're not a childish petitioning, can I have permission? Is it okay? You stand up and step forward and
Yeah.
in your way. And instead of rejection or dejection, it starts to become experience. So as you mentioned, if you have better courting this and that and the other, then there's a piece of that's if you had been made aware that you make the rules, and there are no rules, that you don't need guardrails to be good or bad or indifferent. You're naturally yourself. And some people who are cruel, that's just weakness, and it hasn't grown into past the pupating phase, I
Yeah.
say,
Well,
so.
and this is the helpful thing about the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is if you can get a fairly clear Myers-Briggs score for both you and your wife, you can pretty well predict what the results of your marriage will be. And the Myers-Briggs folks say, if you're different on all four scales, if you're on the opposite side on all four scales, you're going to be fighting all the time. And if you're the same on all four scales, um, it's going to be a boring life. And so it's best to have two or three the same. And I'm blessed with my second wife, who I've been married to for nearly 40 years now, but um, she and I are blessed because we are the same on three scales, and we're not the same on judging and perceiving. But that works because she goes to the grocery store with a list, and I go to the grocery store and buy the ice cream.
Well, yeah, and
Whether I have a list or not.
yeah, and even if all four are the same, there's also the potential of one is more specific, the same, one is
Mhm.
more artistic, the same, and then you get these polar opposites with the same features, which is interesting because then that just brings up framework and perspective.
Yeah. Okay, so reading on. And so in November 1913, during an experiment of self-discovery, quote, my most difficult experiment, unquote, Jung embarked on a search for his own myth. This search would lead him to, quote, a new spring of life, unquote, about which he would later write to Victor White, who was a Dominican priest, quote, I wanted the proof of a living spirit and I got it. Don't ask me at what price, unquote.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
this is why the importance of Colleen Kiber's book, because she wrote this book called Art and Spirit. And what I'm finding is using Colleen's methods, and she's been doing it for 60 years. Um, I did get access to my wellspring, my creative wellspring, and I continue to get that. And so it's a living spirit. It's my living spirit. Nobody can copy it. Maybe at the end of this session today, an hour from now, I'll show what my latest pieces look like. But um, they're I'm in the process of doing a painting for each of my grandchildren and my three daughters, which is 13 people. And in May and June, six of them have birthdays. So I'm currently, I have one left to do for May and June. And then I think I don't have anybody until November, so I have a little more time to produce
Right.
the next one. Okay, so initially, Jung wrote down his fantasies and active imaginations in the so-called black books, which are regarded as a personal protocol of his self-experiment. From there, they found their way into a red leather-bound folio volume, for which he revised the material while also enhancing it with commentary and carefully drawn and meticulously arranged pictures. In Sonasham Dasani's summary view, the Red Book presents, turning the page, the Red Book presents a series of active imaginations together with Jung's attempt to understand their significance. This work of understanding encompasses a number of interlinked threads, an attempt to understand himself and to integrate and develop the various components of his personality, an attempt to understand the structure of the human personality in general, an attempt to understand the relation of the individual to present-day society and to the community of the dead, an attempt to understand the psychological and historical effects of Christianity, and an attempt to grasp the future religious development of the West. Jung discusses many other themes in the work, including the nature of self-knowledge, the nature of the soul, the relations of thinking and feeling, and the psychological types, the relation of inner and outer masculinity and femininity, the uniting of opposites, solitude, the value of scholarship and learning, the status of science, the significance of symbols and how they are to be understood, the meaning of the war, madness, divine madness, and psychiatry, how the imitation of Christ is to be understood today, the death of God, the historical significance of Nietzsche, and the relation of magic and reason. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just got the interesting observation of the death of God being the death of the fully unconscious being. The death of the fully unconscious being is really the resurrection of consciousness from the lotus of consciousness from the mud of unconsciousness. And so that then there's a both. And then that whole metaphor of the lotus growing from the mud becomes life. You know, what's your vehicle? What is your support? What are you based in? What nourishes you? There's the ground, there's the mud, the fertility of the mud.
There's our soul.
It's our soul. And to me, what's interesting is in the spirit is sitting nestled in the soul. And a figure ground example comes to mind. Or if I expand the view frame from the mud to the whole earth, there's a Gaia mind. The earth is a living, feminine, generative organism that continually births your life by how you nourish yourself with nature.
Right. And of course, the significance of Nietzsche's statement, God is dead and we have killed him, is a reference to the basic idea of God that developed in the Western world from the time of Christ up until the time of Nietzsche, or up until the scientific method. And then since the scientific method, basically getting less and less believable until Nietzsche said, God is dead. And what he meant by that was that God is not dead, but God, as described in Christianity, never existed. But it's the way, you know, people who were prophets and holy people over 1,000 years, 1,500 years, envisioned God, and they just built on this edifice. And ultimately, you know, it would be like this edifice behind me being made as a movie set where it's a Potemkin village and it looks very solid, but all it is painted plywood and there's nothing behind it. Right?
Well, completely. And I think that the God is dead piece is that then we pay for our life with our death. And so when you realize that, you become more alive. So I think the God is dead piece is God is dead, meaning we are more enlivened, each of us.
Right. And this is why I've always said that Jung came along in the next generation and not only found God alive, but found where God lives and how God goes about doing the work of the Godhead.
Right, right. Pause
And
behind the curtain was pulled back.
right. And so that's what we're talking about here, is that we're talking about God as being something different than was sold to Christian churches all the way along.
Right.
But nonetheless, God is not dead. God is very much with us, and it's in all of us. And it's in part, it's the collective unconscious. And so Jung showed us, and people have advanced Jung's thought, as Colleen Kibert has done, to show how you can access God, basically, how you can access it. And so when I do my painting, I'm not expecting that my painting is anything about God per se. But as I'm doing the painting, various things come to mind in my life that give me decisive decision points about what I will be doing later in the day. Okay, so for example, or later in the year. And so as I'm doing this work, which is essentially is a kind of meditation, thoughts are coming to my mind, which are important to me, but they're not there on the paper. Okay, they're not in the painting, but but painting, the painting is itself a portrait of my psyche at that point of time. Okay, that's basically what it is. But I mean, in symbolic terms, it's a symbol of my psyche. Okay, because if I'm painting with yellow, um, it's a symbol of hope. That's what it is. Right? And hope obviously has very many facets to it. So it's not saying all those facets, it's only saying, this is where Skip is right now, right? But other
Well, it's
things are
interesting.
coming to mind.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. A lot of people recently asked me, well, tell me about this making besties with beasties thing. I mean, come on, these are terrifying monsters. And I said, you need to get out of the daylight, go to the midnight ocean. You can't see them, they can't see you. They may have 8 heads and golden fangs and teeth and claws, but they can't see you either. So it's in their best interest not to harm you. They may influence you, but then you can address them and go, wow, you're so powerful, like a child in a way. Tell me about your whatever power, strength, life. And what happens is they're inhabiting you. So if it's not yours, okay, take out the trash. And you don't need to talk about it and intellectualize it. It's just literally swimming in the midnight ocean where
Yeah.
you can't see anything. And the thing is, though, they can't see you either. So when you remove the terrified, oh my God, there's a dragon chasing me. No, just something brushed up against my calf under the water. I don't know what it is. It could be a lamprey or, a piece of algae floating. So I think it's interesting to take the terror out of the unknown and immerse in comfortability with the not knowing.
Yeah.
And don't be naive, because there could be plenty of teeth. So I mean, play at your own peril, risk, and treasure. But I still always make besties with beasties. Those are the ones that are going to teach you something, because you got to step up.
Right.
You
So
can't just kind of push them aside.
Yeah, Richard says God can't ever die. If he did, the universe would collapse and everything would have never existed in the first place. God is eternal. That is what we can't fathom. And um, I heard an interesting interview with a famous physicist who said that he's deeply religious, and it goes back to the Big Bang because yes, there was a Big Bang. I'm pretty sure our science, our physicists can explain everything since the Big Bang, but nobody can explain what happened before the Big Bang, or how big that is, or where that is, who, what, when, where, why, and how. And the big thing is, why does our universe exist at all? We don't know. And so anyway, carrying on. Wolfgang Gigerich argues that the Red Book is to be read as Jung's answer to Nietzsche. Like many of his generation, Jung tried to confront the implications of modernity head on. Here, by the way, one may be reminded of Heidegger's and Junger's disputation over the line, in which both, with respect to the question of nihilism, navigate in Nietzsche's wake. But Jung did not see his solution represented in Nietzsche's Übermensch. It was rather in the formulation of a new spirituality. The title of this solution is The Process of Individuation. Okay, so here Arzt is explicitly saying that the new spirituality equals individuation, as we discuss it in Jungian psychology. Quote, the overall theme of the book is how Jung regains his soul and overcomes the contemporary malaise of spiritual alienation. This is ultimately achieved through enabling the rebirth of a new image of God in his soul and developing a new worldview in the form of a psychological and theological cosmology. Liber Novus, which is the Red Book, presents the prototype of Jung's conception of the individuation process, which he held to be the universal form of individual psychological development. Liber Novus itself can be understood on one hand as depicting Jung's individuation process, and on the other hand as his elaboration of this concept as a general psychological schema. Along with Jung's narrative of individuation, many philosophical and theological and psychological questions concerning topics such as God, knowledge, language, logic, meaning, chaos, death, and evil are raised in the Red Book. Several distinct themes and concepts circumscribe Jung's attempt at conceiving a new cosmology. Among others, these are, quote, finding the soul. At the beginning of his self-experiment, Jung is instructed by the spirit of the depths to turn away from the spirit of this time, which represents the scientific materialistic worldview, and follow the spirit of the depths, which, as the ruler of the depths of the world affairs from time immemorial, and for all of the futures, possesses a greater power than the spirit of this time, who changes with the generations. The soul should not be considered as an object of science, an object of a, quote, dead system, unquote, or a, quote, dead formula, unquote, but rather as a living and self-existing being. The path to the soul is difficult and fraught with danger, for the signposts have all fallen. Unblazed trails lie before us. May each go his own way. Further, quote, my friends, it is wise to nourish the soul. Otherwise, you will breed dragons and devils in your heart. The Red Book documents Jung's journey to the rediscovery of his soul, as well as his method of active imagination used to enter into dialogue with what he discovers. Okay, I'm going to take a short bio break, so go ahead and I'll be right back.
Yeah, I love the line of my friends, it is wise to nourish the soul. Otherwise, you will breed dragons and devils in your heart. He has a question mark there. And what's wonderful about that is he's not stating that as a general fact for everyone, but as a enter this question, explore this question. And I think when you enter a question rather than answering a question, you can provide yourself with an experiential journey of exploration, discovery. Your curiosity and wonderment can fuel the navigation. So literally taking a road trip inside of how do you nourish your soul? Basically, what causes joy to enter? And even like a garden, do I need, more nitrogen in the soil? Do I need black dirt, or do I need more sand to open up clay? Or what do I best use for fertilizer to basically put some death back in the soil to resurrect more life moving forward? Dahlias, roses, tiger lilies, orange princess, tulips. What are the flowers? What are the things in your garden, so to speak, rather than dragons and devils in your heart? Because what's interesting about dragons, they're usually really, really elegantly pretty. The colors and the scales and how they may change colors. And I mean, obviously from movies, I'm not, don't have a dragon in the backyard in a cave or anything. But if you look at just how they are drawn, how they are created, how they are painted, how they are caricatured, and not caricatured, but given character in even movie images, I think there is an element of necessity to the nourishing of the soul, just like the movie, How to Train Your Dragon. It takes a whole different perspective. And it's interesting, it takes them from a youthful dragon up through actualizing. And so there's the whole piece of self-development, but it doesn't occur by reading a bunch of books and learning a bunch of stuff and having rote memory about this, that, or the other, and proving to someone else your worth. The currency of value is that you experience your life into being through your actions and your interrelations and how you connect. So in a sense, the dragons and devils in your heart could be those pure, raw, potent pieces of nature that you can unpack to use to nourish your own inner connection. So then you can navigate in the external world that much better. And I'll be curious what Skip thinks about, my friends, it is wise to nourish the soul. Otherwise, you will breed dragons and devils in your heart. It's the kind of thing, well, if, do you choose the good wolf or the bad wolf, the dark wolf or the light wolf? And I think I choose both wolves, that they both befriend one another. And there's a whole make besties with beasties piece. The breed dragons and devils in your heart, well, as if that's a bad thing. We're taught that, these devils are, well, they're just inhabiting an under place, tectonic undercurrent. Well, that can make an interference pattern and surprise you and undermine you literally from below if your soul's not nourished. So I think his whole wise to nourish the soul could, we could exhaustively and continuously talk about it. But I think back to the Midnight Ocean, just stay with the image, just steep and immerse in an image that intrigues you or captivates you in 60 seconds. Just no words, no solution, no outcome, no planning. Literally just settle. Because like a snow globe or a muddy river, the best way to let it clear is to leave it alone. So as Skip comes back, the wise to nourish the soul, that's internal gardening. What do I need in the soil? How much death do I need to pour into the dirt to nourish more and resurrect more life?
Right. And I just had a little nourishment of the soul, which is a long-term Indian business partner of mine was calling me on the telephone to introduce one of his colleagues. I had to make it a short call, but we have, as we just explicitly said to one another, we saved each other's lives multiple times over many years.
Nice.
And so going on now. So this is an important one, soul and the experience of God. The view that the soul is a place for the experience of God permeates the entire Red Book. I am ignorant of your mystery. Forgive me if I speak as in a dream, like a drunkard. Are you God? In Jung's encounter with soul, God does not reveal himself as the God of theologians, who is dead and in need of renewal, but in overwhelming experiences of paradoxical dichotomies found within. For example, the God yet to come is the melting together of sense and nonsense. In the supreme meaning, and as day requires night and night requires day, so meaning requires absurdity and absurdity requires meaning. Thus, the divine encompasses meaning and absurdity, the greatest and the smallest. The supreme meaning is great and small. It is as wide as the space of the starry heaven and as narrow as the cell of a living body. The new God is a coincidentia oppositorum, and God's birth takes place in the inner world. I saw a new God, a child. The God holds the inseparable principles in his power. He unites them. The God develops through the union of the principles in me. He is their union. Viewed in a broader context of Western intellectual history, Nietzsche at the end of the 19th century proclaims the death of God, while Jung in Liber Novus presents the rebirth of God at the beginning of the 20th century. So do you want to comment on that?
It's interesting, when you read it, God holds the separate principles in his power, and you read it, I love the slip, God holds the inseparable principles in his power, as if he's not even doing anything. They're inseparable, but he's uniting the inseparable. And so the paradoxical piece, when you just switch a word, it actually retells the story, the same story, in just a different way, because it still came out where, no, the concept's still intact. And then the God develops through the union of the principles in me. There's this synapse, this space between Nietzsche and Jung, where here's the death and then the new resurrection. So, but it comes about when it resurrects differently, because just like a bulb in the garden, a perennial, over time they naturalize. So that resurrection may not pop up in the same place of the death. The resurrection pops up wherever it feels like. And
Right.
I think naturally that's a nod to how are you placed in your life. Are you not just the center? Are you in context somewhere where you have center is, well, that's cool, that's you, but
Yeah.
no one else needs to know about that.
Right. And I want to grab here for a moment the image of what's coming up next, which is Jung's encounter with Izdubar. And so I'm just looking for it on my computer right now, because this particular section of the Red Book is indeed the resurrection of the God. And so just a minute, let me just find this picture. I have it, but it's not always right at my fingertips, but I think I do have it. Here it is. Okay. All right. So I'm going to share this picture with you because this is from the Red Book, and this is the encounter that Jung is having with the god Izdubar. Now, in this image, you see that Jung is actually down here beneath the feet of Izdubar. So giving you a sense of how large Izdubar is as a god. And you see here all these snakes and crocodiles and various things around Izdubar that are sort of no man's land. And Jung himself is here kneeling before Izdubar and is feeling pretty puny. Okay, so now I'll come back and we'll talk about this section from the Red Book, which is one of my favorites. So it's this segment is called Renewal of the God Image. A key to Jung's oeuvre can be found in the encounter with the wounded mythical figure Izdubar, whom Jung would like to heal. Like modern man, Izdubar becomes paralyzed by the poison that is science because this awful magic, quote unquote, only leaves words in place of gods. Science has destroyed the capacity for belief, quote. And this is an exchange between Jung and Izdubar. But this science is the awful magic that has lamed me. This science is the awful magic that has lamed me. How can it be that you are still alive even though you drink from this poison every day? We've grown accustomed to this over time because men get used to everything, but we're still somewhat lamed. On the other hand, this science also has great advantages, as you've seen. What we've lost in terms of force, we've rediscovered many times through mastering the force of nature. I. Now you perhaps see that we had no choice. We had to swallow the poison of science. Otherwise, we would have met the same fate as you have. We'd be completely lamed if we encountered it unsuspecting and unprepared. This poison is so insurmountably strong that everyone, even the strongest and even the eternal gods, perish because of it. If our life is dear to us, we prefer to sacrifice a piece of our life force rather than abandon ourselves to certain death, unquote. Jung knows that he has to stand by the side of the lame and ill Izdubar, who is his brother, to cure him. After squeezing Izdubar into the size of an egg and putting him in his pocket, Jung succeeds in healing and transforming him, thus leading to a rebirth of mythical sensibility. In the teaching of the Red Book, man embodies the gateway through which crowds the train of the gods and the coming and passing of all times. With Izdubar's rebirth, an understanding of soul, self, and God becomes visible, which Jung much later formulates in answer to Job as the desire of God to continuously incarnate, but already in his Red Book, this finds expression as follows, quote, just as the disciples of Christ recognized that God had become flesh and lived among them as a man, we now recognize that the anointed of this time is a God who does not appear in the flesh. He is no man and yet is a son of man, but in spirit and not in flesh. Hence, he can be born only through the spirit of men as the conceiving womb of the God. Jordan,
Yeah, I think what's interesting back to I think as Richard's comment on, God could not die. Well, what's interesting here is to even in support of that statement, what it is the life and the death as one, they're both present in the living and the dying and the fertility and the resurrection and the composition and the composting and and forever, pretty ad infinitum, ad nauseum kind of thing. But the thing is, then it then turns around to make his statement true, that what happens is, yes, God died, but in the context of life and death being always present, dancing, the death forms the resurrection. So there's a perennial nature of, call it seasonal death, the winter
Right.
sleep of a garden. And in that sense, you could say that the garden is dead. Nope, it's asleep. It's unconscious in that way. And so there's a whole nature piece, I think, in the cannot die, that because it cannot die, it certainly must. So again, you get the paradoxical dichotomy he's talking about, which both and they work.
Yeah. And so it's at this moment, and I love this moment, that Jung, in his active imagination, is realizing the significance of the dichotomy between the physical world and the psychic world and the psyche. And at this point, he is realizing that all gods, up until that moment, have been imagined gods, gods that people had imagined, and they created great memorials to them. They created the pyramids in Egypt and everything, and everybody could imagine those gods, although they never saw them. And God has been given various structures all over the world, depending on which religion you're talking about. But Jung is realizing that this giant before him is humanity's conception of a physical God, and a physical God that can appear at almost any time. And he's realizing that the scientific method has lamed this God because, very simply, when Galileo came along and looked into his telescope, he says, "There's no God up there." Right?
Right.
The sun does not orbit the Earth. The Earth orbits the sun, and they're just two bodies in space. Well, he got hauled up before the Inquisition because that idea alone would have lamed the church. And so the guys who are in the church want to protect their rice bowl. So they were burning people at the stake that said things like that, because they didn't want anybody to find out that this God is in the imagination. It's not in the physical world. And at the time, they, didn't know what the psyche was, and they knew they were pushed along by God within them. And so that's how they behaved. But, Jung says, "No, wait a minute. Here's the way it is. Istabar was really there. Jung painted his picture in the Red Book, and had himself kneeling beneath his feet in that picture. But he was not physically there. And the only physical evidence of it is Jung's painting. But Jung was painting a picture from his unconscious. This is why I'm painting pictures for my unconscious. Jung was of the belief, as Lee Krasner had in the movie Pollock, where Jackson Pollock is painting something on a very big painting, and Lee Krasner says, Jackson, you have to refer to something in nature. And Pollock says, I am nature. And
Hmm.
that's the point. That is the point right there.
Well, and what's interesting, I think, especially the I am nature point there, if I take that and scale it up to the Egyptian Sphinx, and it people say, oh, it was built 2,000 or 4,000 years ago,
Yeah.
and I'll go historically, nope, because what's interesting is why would Egyptians 4,000 years ago um, build an animal in a Pisces or Aquarius 2,000-year epoch that's a lion and the Leo, and I'd have to go 6 signs back, 6 times 2,000, including the last sign, to get the lion aligning in that constellation with the axis of the Sphinx. So to me, historically, then the animal is just this masterful command of the obvious that Egyptology is based on what people have been told. But if you just look at it and say, no, that doesn't add up. Because if I look at just simple math of 6 times 2,000 years equals 12,000 years, then I start to play a game of, is it the lion during the Leo, or was it built 2,000 years before the Leo alignment in the constellation to celebrate the coming of the lion?
And
So,
and I will tell you that the Sphinx was in that single-celled organism at the
yeah,
beginning
there you go.
of modern, at the beginning since the Big Bang. Okay, in other words, that if we follow Jung, we have to say that the Sphinx and the pyramids were already in that single-celled organism that led to us. Okay.
Right. And then the age to me becomes irrelevant directly because of that, because what it is in a general sense, that was an ode to nature,
Mhm.
regardless of which time it originated, because then one of 12 possible animals, or that's arbitrary. Is it standalone? Is it part of a different system that's not even astrological, that has different animals? Like, where's the giraffe? And
Mhm.
where's the and so I think that it was present since that single-celled organism, that the potentiality of what performing an action will do, that determines what's present, not some fated predeterministic stuff.
Right. Okay, so reading on now. Jung's new God, therefore, is a pneumatic God, as Jung elaborates in a letter to Joan Quarry on February 29th, 1919. Quote, the primordial creator of the world, the blind creative libido, becomes transformed in man through individuation. And out of this process, which is like pregnancy, arises a divine child, a reborn God, no more, meaning no longer dispersed into the millions of creatures, but being one and this individual, and at the same time, all individuals, the same in you as in me. Dr. Long has a little book.
Your video froze at seven sermons ad mortuus, seven sermons of the dead.
Out of which the divine out of which the divine child arises. The child is a new God, actually born in many individuals, but they don't know it. He is a spiritual God, a spirit in many people, yet one and the same everywhere. Keep to your time and you will experience his qualities.
Your
Um,
video froze right before you got to seven sermons at mortuus, which is the seven sermons of the dead.
okay.
So Dr. Long has a little book.
Okay, Dr. Long has a little book, Seven Sermons Ad Mortuis. There you find the description of the Creator dispersed into his creatures. And in the last sermon, you find the beginning of individuation, out of which the divine child arises. The child is a new God, actually born in many individuals, but they don't know it. He is a spiritual God, a spirit in many people, yet one and the same everywhere. Keep to your time and you will experience his qualities.
I think too, what's good here is to unpack the word pneumatic for people.
Mhm.
Pneumatic, not so much the pneuma, but pneumatic in architecture, a pneumatic structure is supported by air. So say a membrane dome that has ropes over it to contain the structure, that means is a pneumatic god, is an air god. So
Yeah.
they're dealing with consciousness and spirit and air and daylight and above, rather than the depthful Old Testament below. And I think then there he starts talking about spirit a bunch at the end, spiritual God, spirit in many people. There's then the air of God or the breath of God, where our breath itself is prayer.
Mhm. Right. Okay. So, and in the pneumatic comes the numinous. Okay. And so, um, people can have numinous experiences where they actually feel the breath of God in some way. Um, I have had many, I'm not going to repeat myself here, but I've displayed many of them here, and you can find them in a video that I did in 2019 called "Finding the Living God" on the homepage of this YouTube channel, because the living God is within us, and there I've managed to get 2 videos and numerous images of my numinous experiences, which were quite impressive, both to me and to anybody that else that came along. So, but now I want to go on to the next piece that Dr. Arzt had. Imitatio Christi. With the Red Book, and we're talking about the imitation of Christ here, and he says, with the Red Book identifying the individuation process as the royal road to rediscovering soul and God, Jung reviews the traditional Christian teaching of imitatio Christi. Simply being a devout Christian does not suffice anymore. Instead, the new form of spirituality requires searching for the inner Christ, who stands for the sacrifice and willingness needed to take one's own life into one's own hands while staying faithful to one's essence and one's love, as opposed to remaining in an infantile attitude of imitation. The individual is asked to find a place for Christ in his heart and then follow his independent path during a process of personal growth, living his own life just as Christ lived his. The new God laughs at imitation and discipleship. He needs no imitators and no pupils. In addition to the individual dimension, an eschatological one is of relevance as well. When Jung writes, quote, I believe you have completed your work, since the one who has given his life, his entire truth, all his love, his entire soul, has completed his work. The time has come when each must do his own work of redemption. Mankind has grown older, and a new month has begun. In Jung's later writings, such as Mysterium Conjunctionis and Ion, the symbol of Christ as a symbol of the self will play a significant role. Okay.
And I think the eschatological one, meaning of the word eschatological, is relating to death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and of humankind.
Yeah. And Jung was, or I'm sorry, Christ was providing us with his own example. He came to his ministry to convey the things that he conveyed in his ministry. And when that effort was complete, he went happily unto death. Maybe not, well, certainly happily, not painlessly, but he went to death, his own death, because he knew that that was a part of the deal. And it's probable that whoever had influenced him in the 30 years that we don't know about, or I'm sorry, I guess we know there are about 20 years or 17 years of Christ's life that we don't know where he was and what he was doing. But in that time, sacrifice was an idea that was conveyed to Christ, obviously. And so anyway.
Well, and that goes back to he paid for his life with his death. And Jung said, and don't ask me the cost.
Yeah. And yeah, and if you go back through, if you haven't read the Red Book, if you go back through and listen to our reading and commentary on it, sorry, I lost my train of thought. If you Jung realized at this moment, at the moment of Izdubar, so Jung solved the problem for Izdubar by realizing that Izdubar was in his imagination. And if Izdubar is in his imagination, then in his imagination, he could shrink him down to the size and put him in an egg, which he could put in his pocket. And that was his imaginative leap that, Izdubar in the imagination before Jung could seem very large, but after Jung said, okay, here's Izdubar, I'm going to put him in this egg, and he's in my pocket, and I'm going to take him home to Zurich, and we're going to talk about him. We're going to let him hatch out of the egg, and we'll talk about him.
And the beautiful thing about that imagination piece is he shifted focus to redirect scale. And what he did is he shifted the focus to Izdubar forward iteration. Izdubar was not always that big. He hatched from a small. And so he kind of imaginatively took him to the future, into his egg, and then brought the future potentiality back to the present and hid it in the womb of his pocket, and then rebirthed Izdubar so that the science wasn't poisoning him.
Right. Okay, so I want to stop there because I want to show a couple of my latest pieces that I've done for two of my grandchildren. I'm assuming that they've found their way over to this computer at this point. So let me just double check that they have, and indeed they have. Okay, so I want to share this because this is emanations from my psyche, right? And so the way this is done, my process is simply I do a doodle, and in every movement of the doodle, I'm referential to my psyche, to my unconscious, to tell me where to move the pen. And over years, that has developed into a mark, as Colleen Kibert says. And so I do this doodle, then I color the doodle, and finally I apply this process, which we call Rocky, um, to the process. But all three of those stages come from the unconscious. In other words, my psyche decides where my Rocky pen or my Rocky triple O brush will go drawing the line. So here's the first one. And this is going to be for my 15-year-old granddaughter. And can you see that, Jordan?
I can.
Okay. So first of all, in the center, the granddaughter is represented, and there are many things to see in this. And so let me ask Jordan what he sees.
On the left, this green female crowned queen face looking to the right, in the top, almost take the quadrant 2 on the top left.
Mm-hmm.
Within this Vesica Pisces of the kind of gray running down towards the golden egg that then goes behind it and swoops back around down to the place of creation, third quadrant, and then starts to turn. It doesn't come back because it then almost reverse emanation there from the third quadrant. And then all this orange, it's living in its light, the orange and the red, and there's this fire down at the bottom.
Right.
And then I jump to the fourth quadrant, bottom right, with this purple-haired, red-faced, skeletal death figure. And then from that, I go straight up to all this stuff going on with the gold and the green and the orange, and where everything comes together there with beautifully no order. Except to me, what's interesting, the chaos there, chaos has a negative connotation. And to me, it's just a human-made word for nature. It needs no order. So I like that in that first quadrant, you're starting with this giving form to the formless, where there it's formless, except then I see this little golden thatched roof with this taupey ochre mirror right there above the orange vessel, branch, vein, artery. And then what's cool is there's water in the first quadrant. There's water in the second quadrant. There's deep blue, cobalt, unconscious deep water in the third quadrant. And there's no water in the fourth quadrant, really. It's desiccated. It's dead. So I can track this resurrection path through just that. And honestly, what I like about that is once upon a time, everything I just said is a story, the end, that's just one line. And I could then start somewhere else instead of what caught my eye first. And I'm really kind of interested, and not to explain it, but interested that the golden egg, inner solar plexus sun, that's kind of overlapping like this purple capped acorn, gold acorn, more in the middle top, did not catch my eye first. That green woman queen looking over to that caught my eye first in the second quadrant, which I find curious because now that I look at it, the purple cap, I'll just call it the golden acorn with a purple cap, that's more prominent in terms of it should jump out. But the organic, living, natural composition, I just saw this portraiture carved in green, natural marble, or, Brazilian Ubatuba marble. I mean, in something, but over here on the second quadrant, this face looking to the right with the light on the forehead and the bridge of the nose. So that's kind of I'll stop there. But that's just one line of how many million I could go on.
Oh, sure. And the thing about these is that they are alive. You can never look at them the same way twice. And I've been staring at this golden center thing for a week now as I've been painting this since the 28th of April. And I just finished it this morning. And in this, I can see about 5 or 6 faces that are all different aspects of my granddaughter.
Mm,
So, for example, here with these 2 eyes, and here as a mouth, I can see a sad sack, right? If I use that as the mouth,
mm,
then very sad. But here, if I use this as a mouth, this is pursed lips, right? But if I use this, are you seeing my cursor?
yes.
Okay, so if I use this as the bottom of eyelids, I can say, oh, here she is. She's asleep. She's
Mm,
sleeping. And, never mind what's going on up here. And then here, I I see a different face with eyes up here, or even these eyes and this nose. And this is the mouth, which is a big grin. And if I turn it 90 degrees, let's see how it changes. So here, again, you can see different faces, etc. And I'll just do this fairly quickly because, but like here, for example, you can very
mm,
obviously see a smiling face here, right?
yep.
And so on. So this is after 2 quarter turns, and this is back to the original. And here, coming out of this nightcap, I'm seeing a tiger. This is a tiger,
Oh,
uh,
I see that now.
right? And here, coming all the way over from the dreams and visions quadrant, is a dragon. See this dragon?
Hmm.
All the way around here. This is the face. The head of the dragon is here, but it has feet and it has claws, and it's an amazing dragon, actually.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting is then from that's that whole Vesica Pisces, that
Right.
three pronged that I was seeing before. If I go back down to the third quadrant, bottom left, I now see this above ground rhizome, this segmented plant, has the around vining up towards the middle at a 30-degree
Hmm.
angle. And
Hmm.
what's interesting, it's not a choking vine. It's a look at the vine creating this almost living crystalline lattice structure that
Hmm.
turns into this dragon that turns back into staring right at that original queen I was talking about. So,
Yeah.
in a sense, she's talking about besties with beasties. She's
Yeah.
in that second quadrant in that triangle between the two Vesica Pisces, the triad structure. The dragon is part of that structure. So it's interesting how I go from formed dragon back to unformed rhizome, just a root kind of
Yeah.
growing towards. And then the queen, the evolution of the dragon, natural leader. And she picks up every nostril flare in the room. And so then you have so many pieces of, again, back to what's the myth. To me, a simple way to say what's the myth, use the word arcana, which just means hidden or mystery. And
Hmm.
it's what is the story? What visual story does this tell? And I use that at my table. Once upon a, what catches your eye? Which part of which image catches your eye? And they'll point, and I'll say, so once upon a time, tell the story of the card, the end. And then they'll go in and they will start to tell their inner nature story from the visual story they're connecting with. So I
Right.
love that you pulled the dragon because, until I saw it, I couldn't. But now what's seen cannot be unseen. And
Yeah, sure.
it's pretty specific.
Yeah. So now, take your mind out a ways, and there's a couple of really big faces here. So the face, if you think of the face coming from the top of the head down this way and coming around
Oh
all the
yeah.
way around the dragon, now you see that this orange is an eye, and the dragon is also in an eye, is a green eye. So there's the green-eyed monster, and the which is unconscious or invisible, right? And the
you could, you have the mote in God's eye there.
right. And if I turn, it's a little easier to see if I turn it this way, I think. Let me just see. Okay, this is a little easier to see, but there's this huge face here, which comes around here. This is the chin, and it goes up this way to this eye here and an eye here. Or you can pick, let me put it back the original way, because it's okay. So here's what I was talking about. Um, you can see an eye here and an eye here. Okay, the pupil of an eye here and here, or here and here, also different ways of looking at it. And according to Colleen's map of the soul, which I concur with at this point, um, the lower left represents the creative wellspring, right? The upper left represents dreams and visions. So everything on the left side of the picture is the past, and everything on the right side of the picture is the future. And so the yellow represents hope. And so here, coming out of my granddaughter, is a natural flow that comes into hope, and it actually splits this evil figure in half.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, there's lots more here, but and then the lower right is represented mostly in purple, by purple, and that represents wisdom. It is dead, as you were saying, but as we live our lives, some things die and some things live on. And so this lower right is the tools by which you fulfill your mission. Your mission is your upper right here.
Well, it's
So,
interesting you say that too, because while you were on your short break, I mentioned the what fertilizer do you use in the garden of your soul? And so in that sense,
mhm,
you're coming up upon that death. You know, what death do you pour into the dirt to nourish the life that you're finding there in that fourth quadrant, bottom right?
right. And Sherry says, is thought a movement of time? Um, hmm. Yeah, maybe for each one of us, that's so. Um,
Or is thought in context of time
yeah,
relatively, or
right.
both? I mean, it's
And so
unanswerable.
right. And so one point is that people can look at this and say, well, this is just chaos here. But as you see, there's lots of things in this.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, over here, there's another set of eyes with dark pupils and sort of a snout of an evil creature type. This is a nightmare kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the blue eyes you can see here, and lots of salamandery things in there. Um, and so the point is that as as you paint this, as I painted it, I had no intention to create anything specific other than a painting for my granddaughter. That's it. Okay. And this is what emerged. This is a picture of my psyche trying to paint a picture for my granddaughter, following some parameters, following the parameters that are a part of my mark, which you can learn about in Colleen's book in chapters 11 through 13 if you don't have it. And you can find Colleen Kibert. I'll just put her name on the chat for, it's colleenkibert.art. If you go to that link, you can find Colleen's book. And so the Rocky technique, the last technique, I don't know if I got this right. Let's see if this will be better. Okay, so the Rocky technique, which produced all the short lines, is described in chapter 17 of her book. And I've just been really enjoying this because it has become my go-to morning to get my mind together before I go to school. And I just use it as a meditation technique. But so much is coming out of it. I want to keep going. And so Colleen and I and some others are going to be hosting some sessions coming in June where we are going to have people display whatever came from their psyche in the previous month, beginning in June, and working through the election to see. Okay, now I'll show you the one other painting that I did, which is this one. This one was for my twin grandson. So he has a lot of stuff going on too, but obviously quite different from my granddaughter. And I wanted to portray a younger environment for him because he's going to be 7 in June, whereas my granddaughter for that other painting is 15 in June. So this is intended to be lighter in color and therefore more accessible for a younger child. But as you see here, there's a face with 2 eyes there and a little mouth. And there's a hand coming down here. So this is like a forefinger pointing, and another finger maybe is pointing here. And, lots of creatures down here in this creative wellspring, which is the ancestors, right? And then dreams and visions. And of course, here's a guy looking down with a long nose, a Pinocchio nose, and lots of elephants in these things too. Mm. So I'm not going to bother you all with all the details there, but the point is that this is all coming through from my unconscious, and whether you like it or not, I don't care, because for me, it's become my meditation technique. And oh, by the way, it's so many people have said it's beautiful to me that I say, well, I guess I'm going to give one of these to each of my grandchildren and frame it. And so I've started to do that. And this will be the next batch. I have 5 to give out in the next 4 weeks. So
nice.
So I only have 1 more to do. I've done 4 of them. So anyway,
well, excellent session today.
Huh?
Excellent session today.
Yeah. So we have 1 more session to go on Thomas. So we'll start with Union of Opposites on the 28th. And I think that Jordan's comment about, how are these opposites, but they're stuck together, but we're we're the ones that are pulling them together. That's an interesting thought that we should explore further next week. So anyway,
Yeah, so I mean, T.S. Eliot said, there's nothing new, but everything must be unique, or there's nothing new, but everything must be original. And if you say it, there's nothing original, but everything must be new, it still works the same way. So it's,
right.
I think, back to the lineage and the rhizome of soul.
Right. Well, the thing that I like about this painting technique, I actually had two other painting techniques that I developed about 20 years ago. And I found that someone else had beaten me by a good 40 years with those techniques. But what I feel confident about this approach of Colleen's is that that you cannot copy my method. Okay. In other words, you can do a doodle and that'll be your mark. It won't be my mark. You won't be able to
Right.
follow my mark. So just from the mark, if anybody, say 100 years from now, my work becomes famous and somebody wants to decide whether a painting was done by me or someone else, I'm not going to tell you my secrets, but an expert would see my secrets and, and I'm basically going to describe them to people anyway, but, an expert would see my secrets and know whether a painting was a copy of something, a copy after Skip, or whether it's a unique piece. And what I'm finding about this is every piece is unique, but every piece is also very identifiable to my mark and to my color palette and all kinds of other things. By my hand. There's no question about that. So, so Cherie makes a final comment here. Love does not consist in gazing at each other, but looking together in the same direction. Okay, well, that's absolutely true. So, and Richard says, Gamiophytes of fern spores are rhizomes. I recently grew some, and it's an amazing process. Okay. I don't doubt it. Everything's based on a rhizome. We just don't, we may or may not know what our rhizome is. Right. Jung spent his whole life figuring that out. But anyway, peace, everyone.